Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone. It's Dylan in the host chair once again. I've got a very distinguished gentleman with me today, if he cares to introduce himself.
Hey guys, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
I know from that pause that wasn't exactly who y'all were expecting, but we have Evan Buck on the recording today. And today, Evan and I are going to take advantage of our kind of religious educations to explore, ironically enough, and this is not to imply anything, but one of the greatest frauds in history, I think, in terms of a document. We're going to go back to the year 315 by way of the year 1054 and explore the donation of Constantine. Now, just to give you a bit of background, the donation of Constantine was supposedly a grant from Constantine the Great shortly after he became emperor of the then ginormous Roman Empire that covered not only Italy, Gaul, all of that stuff, but also Greece, Anatolia, the Holy Land. This is the empire at almost its greatest extent. Once he becomes emperor, supposedly, he executes a document that conveys essentially control over Rome, its environs, and all of Italy to the Pope. And I'm going to actually quote you some of the things from the document just so you understand exactly how much this document supposedly gives him. It conveys to Sylvester I, who's the Pope at the time, a bunch of Roman insignia and privileges that the Roman Empire traditionally had. The Lateran Palace, which at the time was under construction, it was going to be the emperor's basically fancy new palace in Rome, as well as the city of Rome and all of the provinces, districts, and cities of Italy or of the Western regions. And it also gives the Pope supremacy as well over the four chief seats, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem, and Rome, and is also over all the churches of God in the whole world. So basically, this document gives what amounts to political control, supposedly, over half the empire and supreme religious authority over the entire world in terms of the Christian faith to the Pope. This is the foundation that the popes use for basically the next 1,000 years and change in our timeline to sort of demonstrate and support their sort of control politically. They're able to both literally and figuratively be kingmakers in the medieval world and exercise the control over the papal states and kind of the religious authority of the Western world. There's a slight problem. As you may have guessed from the fact that I've already talked about this as a forgery, the donation of Constantine has a few problems. It was widely accepted as true in the Middle Ages, as we'll get into in our fork, but it wasn't until the Renaissance that people started really calling it out, asking questions. And just to give you an idea of some stuff, there are some fairly obvious clues that this thing wasn't actually written in 315. There's some use of terms like fief, satrap to refer to Roman provinces that Constantine had. These are terms, fief is a classic medieval feudalist term that wouldn't come into existence for several hundred years. Same with satrap. That just wasn't a term that was used at the time. He references the consulate of Constantine, the fourth consulate of Constantine, which we know was in 315, being at the same time as the consulate of a man named Gallicanus, who was co-consul with somebody in 317. But he and Constantine were never co-consuls together, so you have a year discrepancy already. He, in the document, references Constantinople, which wasn't a thing for almost 20 years by the time the document was supposedly written. Everybody knows Constantinople was founded on the old Roman city of Byzantium, which used to be a historically huge city. At the time we're talking about, it had lost its city privileges and had only just recently technically gotten them back, but it wasn't actually a city. And Constantinople wasn't founded until like 326 or 330. And it wasn't even called Constantinople. It was called Nova Roma, which in an official document from a Roman emperor is probably the name that would have been used had the city actually existed. Um, there's also, and this is kind of a random aside, but in a document that supposedly gives control to the Pope over the political control of Italy, you would think that when Constantine died, the coinage, which at the time, historical records, this is how historians track the reigns of kings, is when coins swap from depicting one king to another king. Old king kicks the bucket, new king takes the throne. He starts putting his face on all the coins. You would think that if the Pope had actual direct political control over Italy, that Roman Italian coins would switch from Constantine to whoever the Pope was at the time. And that did not happen. So there's quite a few pretty obvious indicators, had anybody bothered to look closely, that this was a fake or a forgery for something. The first time that this was really referenced was in the mid 700s, late 700s, when the popes kind of start to pressure Pepin and some of his successors, including Charlemagne, to give them lands in what is now the Papal States and in Italy. But it's never officially, explicitly, like straight up cited, quoted, used in a debate until 1054.
Yeah, basically, it was kind of like, hey, the Lombards are coming and giving us problems, raiding us, sacking us a little bit. Could you give us some help? Because, yeah, remember that one time that Constantine, helped us out a lot? You should do that too. And Pepin, at the time, he was kind of angling, trying to get his own shot at the throne. Even if they were specifically referencing this document, he was illiterate. So imagine you trying to be coronated and trying to gain power, and you're having this document waved in front of your face that you can't read, and the Pope is basically saying, "Hey, help us out, please help us out, help me, and I'll help you." And so,
yeah, trust me, bro. This totally says what I say it says.
Yeah, sources, dude, trust me. Like that's literally essentially what it boiled down to. And so that's what happened in the 750s, which is, by the way, probably when this document was actually written and forged to begin with, is during these whole controversies and raids from the Lombards. This is when it was probably written. And so, but that was like a reference to it. We didn't actually have it like enshrined in legal code and fully used as leverage until the 1050s.
Yeah. So the first time it comes up is directly is in 1054. Pope Leo IX gets into what I like to imagine as the medieval equivalent of a nerdy debate team argument with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who has one of the coolest medieval names I've ever heard of, Michael I Cerularius. So they're sending letters back and forth. Basically, to make a long story really short, they're debating the nature of the primacy of the Roman Pope, who sits as the Bishop of Rome, versus the kind of Eastern Orthodox, even though this, for like 6 months, this still isn't Eastern Orthodox. The four kind of ancient sees that the document references of the Patriarch in Constantinople and Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, these other famous holy cities of Christianity. The Pope is saying, yeah, he's pulling the Somali pirate looking at the Constantinople Patriarch Tom Hanks going, look at me, I'm the captain now. You have to do what I say.
He's basically like, you must have amnesia because you forgot that I'm him.
Yeah. So that's basically what this debate amounts to. It's the nature of the church, the primacy of the Pope as the Bishop of Rome versus all these other guys. And in 1054 in our timeline, the fraud is never revealed. This is what actually creates the Great Schism over these issues, not just this, but iconoclasm, some other, determinations of church doctrine, whether you have to use leavened or unleavened bread in church services. I don't mean to sound super sarcastic, but if you take the religious context out of it, you're like, really, guys, a debate over bread? It's in isolation, it's one of those things like, but these are the kinds of things, these natures of church doctrine that they're debating. In our timeline, like I said, this fraud doesn't get revealed. So this is what leads to the Great Schism. This is the moment when Catholic Christianity diverges from kind of the Eastern Orthodox and Greek Orthodox, all the various orthodoxy traditions of Christianity. Our exploration today is, what if at this point in time during this debate, this document had been revealed to as a fraud? And there basically, I'll let Evan get to the gist of it, but basically what this amounts to is, this amounts to the Patriarch of Constantinople pulling an Uno reverse card on the Pope and saying, all right, show me your hand.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is basically like Kendrick versus Drake, and Kendrick drops A minor at the Super Bowl halftime show. This is basically the equivalent of that. So the way that we're going to go about this fork and how we're going to get this fraud exposed, because the way it was exposed in our timeline is pretty interesting, but we're not going to be able to delve fully into that in this episode. But what we're going to do here is we're going to take someone who also has a pretty cool medieval name himself, the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Constantine the Ninth Monomachos. I probably butchered that name, but I still think it sounds pretty cool, even if it is butchered. So by his name, yes, he is actually a descendant of Constantine, the one that we are referencing, the one that's in this document, supposedly from 315. So in our timeline, he's the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, and he's not super keen on the whole, Rome constantly, the Pope constantly asking for help, constantly asking for backup. I mean, that's why in the 750s, the popes kind of started to try to align themselves more with the Franks and with Pepin and Charlemagne. And so in our timeline, the Byzantine emperor at the time, he wasn't really super keen on everything that was going on, but he wasn't really able to have a dog in the fight because, as it turns out, he had no fight in the dog. He did not have that dog in him. He unfortunately caught a cold or some variant of some weird medieval disease that we don't necessarily know what happened. And so in our timeline, while all of this was raging and going on, Constantine the Ninth passed away. In our timeline, we're going to have him not pass away from the mysterious disease, either at this time, or, it could be delayed a little bit, or he just continues to reign for a little bit longer. And this gives him a little bit more time to be able to actually insert himself into this debate. And essentially, like Dylan and I before the show, we were kind of talking about, he'll be like Gandalf, going into the library and throwing open all the scrolls, figuring out what's happening and going on, and then being able to say famously to the Pope, I have no such memory of this document. He'll be able to just essentially prove linguistically and, from all the details that the document got wrong, there's no way that this thing is legitimate. There's no way this thing is real. So that's the nature of our fork. The donation of Constantine is going to be exposed as a fraud. And in our timeline, even when it was exposed as a fraud, it was actually still used and believed by a decent amount of people for church authority. And by that point, there had been, hundreds upon hundreds of years of the popes, meddling in what is referred to as temporal affairs. So it's kind of hard to, remove so much of that power so quickly. But in our timeline, we're in the middle of this fight, and we only have maybe 300 years or so of a tacit understanding of this Pope's authority, this Pope's power. This is really the first time it's actually being significantly claimed and now significantly challenged. So that's the nature of the fork. So Dylan, what do we think are going to be some of the first effects from this donation being exposed as a forgery?
Yeah, so I think first I'm going to set up one thing that immediately gets shattered and then not talk about it because we need time for it to cook for like 150 years and then we can come back to it. And then I'll get to the actual geopolitical stuff. So one of the big reasons why this being revealed as a fraud at this time is such a big deal goes all the way back to the formation, not just of the Roman Empire, but also to the Roman Republic, is this idea of translation of power, specifically the translation of the Roman imperial power. It's referred to as translatio imperii, or literally the transfer of power. in the Roman imperial sense, this means that, on the moment of an emperor's death, there is an imperial transfer of all of the rights, privileges, power, and authority over control of the Roman state, yada, 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 to whoever the new emperor is. The donation of Constantine renders this translatio imperii as a gift from Constantine to the papacy, whoever beholds the papacy, functionally, according to the document, making the Pope essentially a theocratic emperor by virtue of the conveyance of this grant.
And here's also something important to keep in mind as well, is that this was really the Pope basically pulling a take back, because you're probably wondering, well, what's the purpose of the Roman emperors, sticking around if the Pope was really the one who's ruling and, the puppet master behind the scenes? According to the document, Pope Sylvester was just such a nice, magnanimous guy
yes.
that instead of actually taking the reins that Constantine gave him, Sylvester was like, nah, man, you know what? This one's on me. I healed you of leprosy and you gave me half the kingdom, but you know what? I'm good for it, bro. Go ahead and rule. You're good. And so that's how Constantine and all the Roman emperors, supposedly had this authority that Dylan is talking about. So then Pope Leo IX comes along and says, okay, you know what, Sylvester, that was a little bit of a mix-up. I'm the one in control now. That when Dylan was talking about the Somali pirate, I'm the captain now. I'm the captain now. It was essentially a giant take back.
Yeah. And the reason why this is a big deal is the knock-on effects that it has, more for what it does to undercut the papacy, because this is 1054 we're talking about. You've got to remember the last probably about 300 years have been some of the most formative in terms of what in the modern day we understand as sort of the beginnings of the formation of the modern European lay of the land, nation states, and things like that. Most significantly, the crowning of the Franks in general as kind of the de facto, powers that be in Western Europe, and specifically Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor, which, as people will famously say, is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
Nor an empire.
But if, the Pope is the one who crowns him as this, and what this in our timeline kind of sets up is the Holy Roman Empire is this sort of counterpole to the Eastern Roman Byzantines, who, by pretty much any metric, are still the real Roman Empire, and in fact referred to themselves as such. Without the donation of Constantine kind of backing up this whole concept, everything that the popes have done is, at the very least, kind of suspect. So put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it, I promise. But that's just something to keep in mind. That's what's going to underpin all of everything we're going to talk about for the rest of the episode. The most immediate, probably, geopolitical impacts are two things. One, the Norman conquest of England. Two, the Norman conquest of Sicily. This is the Norman heyday. They're copying the homework and giving it to everybody. It's out there. First, the Norman conquest of England. 1066, William, the Bastard of Normandy, wins the Battle of Hastings, presses his arguably, potentially, completely made up, very remote genealogical claim to the King of England. Edward the Confessor died as the last childless king of kind of Anglo-Saxon England, and that's what kicks this dust up off between William, Harold Hardrada, and Harold Godwinson. Too many Harolds in the story already. We're going to end it right here. William presses his claim in part supposedly because he was anointed by Edward the Confessor as his successor in some mystical backroom deal that nobody remembered except William and Edward, who is now dead and can't back it up. But William which is always
the basis of every strong claim,
every legitimate claim of government. Yes,
to political legitimacy. Exactly.
Yeah, it's you just trust me, bro.
Just trust me, bro. Right next to golfing a hole in one on all 18 holes
and inventing the cheeseburger. Let's not forget.
Yep.
But he was too tired to go home and invent the internet, so we got to give him credit for that. But William the Conqueror also did have papal support. Now, most of this papal support kind of reads in the historical record sort of like an after the fact sort of justification, feather in the cap kind of thing. Like, oh yeah, I also had the Pope's support He had a papal banner, supposedly had the support from the monarchs of Europe, but like nobody actually showed up. It was all William and the Normans. So I think immediate short term, William still conquers Normandy. His claim may be a little more shaky because it doesn't have this implied divine support via the Pope, but boots on the ground, the Anglo-Saxon residents of England are still going to have to be learning how to speak French real quick. The more interesting one is Sicily. So about the same time as William the Conqueror invades England, a Norman noble named Robert Guiscard sails a fleet around and invades Sicily. Sicily is, for those of you who may not have stared at European map games like me for hundreds of hours, is the island that's right off the boot of Italy. Historically, even in ancient times, it was Greek. It was originally Greek colony states. Archimedes invented all of his crazy Nikola Tesla, doom weapons in the Greek city of Syracuse, which was a Greek colony on the island of Sicily. Then it became Byzantine territory, and then it was lost to Arabic invaders at this time, kind of Muslim adventurers as they sort of swept across North Africa. The Normans invade Sicily right around this time, kind of in the late 1050s, 1060s. And this is the bigger, I think, immediate geopolitical problem because, one, the Normans are now directly underneath the Pope, who is claiming this sort of.
I was just going to say, take one look at a map of medieval Europe at this time, and you understand that the papacy is now directly bordering these guys.
Yeah. So the Normans invade Sicily and are now directly underneath. And, the Normans, even though they're Christian, they were not afraid to go on some, raiding adventures, mess with people's politics, kind of take stuff where they could. Because you have to remember, these guys are only, maybe 200 years, if we're being generous, from being axe-wielding Vikings raiding everybody's stuff. So they still have that in them. And also, a Norman invasion of Sicily presents a direct problem to the Byzantines, because the Byzantines just had this territory not a couple hundred years ago. This is traditional. This is like ancient, even before the Romans had it. This is Greek territory. So the Byzantines, one, are mad that somebody stole their stuff. Not really stole, got it back before they could get it back. But anyway, and now, the Normans would be antagonists of the Byzantines at one point in one of the Crusades. I forget which one. The Normans actually landed in mainland Byzantine imperial territory with an army. So the Byzantines are very concerned that these weird French-speaking people in Sicily might become a problem. That's the most immediate geopolitical concern, and I think it's honestly not all that exciting of a change because the Sicilian Normans are going to do kind of what they did in our timeline, which is either help or hinder or cause problems, however it kind of suits them. So that, I think, functionally is really not going to be all that different, at least in the short term. They may feel more adventurous in southern Italy in kind of the boot and things like that, but probably not a whole lot different. I think the first real interesting thing that we can talk about is 1096, which, just a couple of decades later. Those of you who have not obsessively watched Kingdom of Heaven, like I have, or played Crusader Kings, may recognize this as the date that Urban II famously calls Deus Vult and kicks off what becomes the First Crusade. That, I think, is the first big meet because Urban II only calls the First Crusade because he has a request for help from the Byzantine emperor. If we're in a timeline that has a pope who has functionally been exposed as a fraud, one, does the Byzantine emperor even ask for his help instead of trying to go to the European powers directly? And two, even if the Pope does try and call a crusade, does anyone care that it's coming from the Pope?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, and I think this is the biggest part where this starts first getting exposed. Well, not getting exposed, but like actually having a big effect. I think, because here's the thing. Like I made reference to before, the donation of Constantine was really the main claim for not only specific territories, but also the Pope's ability to engage in temporal affairs. to begin with. He's not just seen as like the Bishop of Rome, and he has this, the infallibility of the Pope in terms of a religious sense, as the spokesman of God, that kind of thing. He also now has this ability to interfere in European affairs and to play kingmaker and to decide that it's time to go and reclaim the Holy Land. In this timeline, I think there would be I think there would be kind of a combination of reactions. I think there'd be probably enough people that would agree with the Pope on like a religious personal level to the where we're like, yeah, we should do this. We should go ahead and do this thing. But then I also think that there would be enough of a counter reaction to where people would probably be like, oh yeah, you and what army? Like, okay, you can say this all you want, but kind of like, as we make reference to a lot on this show, Andrew Jackson telling the Supreme Court, all right, go ahead and enforce your order. Like, you don't really have any way or mechanism to do this. So I do think there's a possibility that the Pope maybe works the phones a little bit in this. And he says, all right, you know what? I think my power is not going to, my endorsement is not going to be, and really my organization of this is probably not going to be as successful. So how about I co-sign onto it instead of actually being the main force de jure behind this? I'm going to be the, somebody that signs on to it and be like, yeah, you know what? This is a great idea. It totally wasn't my idea in case it doesn't work out. But if it does work out, I was enthusiastically supporting it from day one. But he's able to kind of basically be like another, religious cheerleader, I guess you can say, for this effort. But he might work the phones a little bit, and he might try to get the Byzantine emperor really to be the main one to try and push this forward, I would say. And if he could work the phones, he can try to get the Byzantines involved, but he can also try to get more of, the Western side involved as well, I think. I think the Pope would function more as a phone worker, an intermediary, and a little bit of a religious endorsement, as opposed to being the main driver of the crusade. I think that's the main difference we're going to see in this timeline.
Yeah, I would agree. And I realized when I kind of took us down this particular point, I phrased things like I was implying that the Pope was basically a functional non-entity, and that is not the case.
No.
Quick ecclesiastical detour back into the Great Schism. So I think with a revelation of the donation of Constantine as a fraud, the Pope just loses his kind of, like I said, this sort of imperial diktat authority. He is very much still the Bishop of Rome. He is still the bishop of one of the five pentarchic sees of orthodoxy. So he is still one of the most important religious figures, regardless of what other Catholic stuff is going on. So he's still very much an important religious authority. But I do think you're right, Evan. I think it's going to come less of a Pope Urban II's famous speech of calling the First Crusade. It's going to be Pope Urban II, Bishop of Rome, or Patriarch of Rome, whatever, forwards the Byzantine emperor's message for assistance against the foes of Christianity, not Catholic Christianity, but just Christianity in general.
I think it's Christianity at large, because remember, you're wanting to get as many forces as possible to go and do what you want to do. So trying to make this about any sort of particular strain of Christianity, I think the Pope recognizes, especially, with the donation being revealed as a fraud, that the game is up there, in terms of how much he could do on a specific, religious sense and a political sense. He just kind of has to be the one that helps to push things along.
Yeah, I think the impact really is more of a after the fact historiography perspective. Like, I don't think people on the ground would have seen much of a difference either way.
No,
except for the one thing I will point out is one of the famous things about the calls to the Crusades are papal indulgences. This is a thing that happens before this, but this is one of the first really wide scale. Anybody can get a papal indulgence, just like general across the board. If you participate in the Crusades, you can get a papal indulgence. I think that might be questionable from rather than a Pope of Roman Catholicism, the supreme interpreter of the will of God, the patriarch and bishop of Rome, that may be a little questionable. But I think boots on the ground, reality wise, that's not going to be as much of an impact. I actually think that might be better in the grand scheme of things for some of the like
I think it
children's
would be
crusades
better.
and poor people's crusades that just like
Yeah.
went with no plan and no leader and no weapons and
I
just got
think that
straight
would lead,
massacred.
I think that would lead a little more credence to that because all of the things that helped, lead to, Pope Urban's call for the First Crusade still happen just as
Hmm.
easily in
Hmm.
our timeline. In fact, a lot of what was used to, justify the First Crusade happened in like the late 990s, early, early thousands.
Yeah.
Like the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre,
Hmm.
still happens. All of those things still happen. I think it's more so, like you said, Dylan, it's less of a, boots on the ground reality change versus an overarching, ripple effect change for the Pope's power moving forward.
Yeah. And I think honestly, I don't think the First Crusade, whether some of the battles change, from tactical battle to tactical battle, I think the First Crusade as a general idea doesn't really change. At least
I don't think so either.
until the creation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in which case then I think if you have a more incorporated bishopric of Rome into the sort of general scheme of kind of overall orthodoxy, the Pope does probably have some special privileges. Whatever this Catholic versus Orthodox thing is still kind of simmering, but everybody's sort of still more cohesive. I think in a world like that, I wonder if just from a pure practicality standpoint, Jerusalem becomes less associated with the Western European power, specifically the Franks, and more aligned with the
I'd
Byzantines
say the Byzantines. Yeah.
as a political ally and neighbor state. Because you have to remember, they're the guys that are next door. The Byzantines are
Yep.
the ones who are getting their door knocked down by the Seljuk Turks asking for help. Why does a French kingdom of Jerusalem that is more closely dynastically related and politically related to Western Europe, why does that help them at all other than just carve out some territory that the Arabs and the Turks are going to try and get back? It doesn't. So I
Yeah.
think Jerusalem's going to have a natural tendency to look more towards Byzantium in this. And I think that then carries counter knock-on effects. I think Jerusalem's, and I'm not going to go into the kind of internecine nature of the politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because oh boy, there could be a whole
Oh boy.
historical podcast
There could
series
be a
about the hot mess
whole
of that.
series about that. Yeah.
But I think a stronger presence of the Byzantine Empire could give a greater stability and guiding hand in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I think the Crusades become much more interesting as you go on because you have, like I said in the tours episode we did, the Byzantine Empire kind of goes through these dead cat bounces where they're on the
Yeah.
outs, they come back for a bit, they're on the outs again, they come back for a bit. A more closely aligned Kingdom of Jerusalem, I think, helps them a little bit more, kind of
Mhm.
stabilize. Because if you have a Jerusalem that listens to the Byzantine Empire more, they can coordinate military campaigns a little bit. Obviously, Jerusalem's still, an island amidst a sea of a different faith, but your geostrategic kind of mapping and planning becomes a whole lot different with closer coordination.
Yeah. And I think, this helps out because something that I think we also skipped over a little bit was this idea of the legitimacy of the papal states, because that was,
Yes.
A donation of Pepin the Short. And when things, are kind of shown as being fraudulent in the 1050s, I highly doubt that this is going to be a situation where everything snaps back to what it was before. And the Franks are just like, okay, you know what? Yeah, that's a fraud. We're going to take back all that land now. Thank you very much. For various reasons, I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that the papal states are not going to become, as influential as they were in our timeline, where we had, the Pope basically anointing, the head of the Holy Roman Emperor, as we, talked about earlier in this episode. They're just kind of going to be probably doing their own thing, more internally focused. And so as a result, and also focused with, the problem of the Normans, like right on their border with Sicily as well. So I think this will, in the short to medium term, I think, Dylan, the best way that we can summarize the main changes from this are that, because like the Crusades are going to happen still, the Pope is still going to be a very important religious figure and influence within the church as it's, really starting to grow and, coalesce more into an entity, a polity almost. But what you're going to have is, as the main change is, and we discussed this a little in the pre-podcast as well, is do we have as massive, as violent a split still in the Great Schism, or does it become more akin to two different branches of that are still kind of operating under the broader, Catholic umbrella? Because like in our timeline, we have the Orthodox Church is, because, we can get into ecclesiastical church structure later. But we have like the Orthodox Church is versus the Catholic Church as one more of a broader, top-down Roman style sort of authority structure. In this timeline, I don't know if, yeah, I think there's still a split for sure in terms of, the leavened versus unleavened bread sort of disputes.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is an open question whether or not we actually have as explicit of a church split, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a question of how's it perceived on the side of the kind of the communities that are directly under the kind of influence of the Pope and the bishopric of Rome versus how it's perceived by, sort of the traditional Orthodox territories of the Byzantine Empire, or sort of kind of the Balkans. And at this point, we're making inroads to kind of the Slavic states and Russia. And the reason I say that is because, the Western Europeans, we've talked about how the Pope is still going to be important as the Bishop of Rome in this religious theater. A leader. He's just not going to be quite the kingmaker that he was. I think from their perspective, they may see themselves a little bit more separately because they're in the thick of it than sort of the East does, because the East has this much more syncretic, synergistic, almost small d democratic perception of how the church is run. All these, Orthodoxy has all these different Orthodox patriarchies and churches in it. You've got Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Oriental Orthodoxies of all kinds. You've got kind of Nestorians also in the mix. You've got all these different churches that have their own sort of patriarch, but are all kind of versions of this sort of Eastern Orthodox idea scheme. And they all kind of run, especially sort of democratically, where it's much more communal focused. So, they still kind of have these synods and these councils of bishops that you saw earlier in Christianity when it was still being formed, at council of insert city name here, where they hash out these issues of the church. It's much more like that, where instead of the popes, issuing a papal bull on whatever specific issue there is, and there you go, Pope said it. He's in the seat.
The argument is
That's
settled.
it.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think especially the Eastern Orthodox are going to see whatever version of Catholicism develops as kind of one of these sort of synod flavors.
It's one of those things that's like, it's kind of like flavors of ice cream. You have different flavors of ice cream, but they're all still ice cream at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Kind of, that's more akin to, the Orthodox model during this time, and still is. And so they would probably see like whatever the Pope is doing as, all right, man, go do your thing. Go rule the papal states, which by the way have very questionable, now political authority now. And so I think there could be, in terms of like the actual papal states themselves, it could probably be a sooner, like in our timeline, with the unification of Italy and everything, that's getting way down the timeline. But just to kind of give a preview of coming attractions, it's kind of funny what happens. Basically, Italy starts unifying, taking over what is known as the papal states. And then even though they take and legally like annex everything, the Kingdom of Italy refuses to take over what is now known as the Vatican City.
Yeah.
And so I think in our timeline, we'll probably have the Pope realizing that his temporal power or temporal authority is not, um, you know, really as well supported anymore.
Mhm.
So we could see an instance as well where the papal states still exist, but are now being administered with the Pope being the Bishop of Rome on a religious
Yep.
sense, and then he crowns or he gives authority to the ruler of the papal states, we'll just call it
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So those still exist, but the Pope will not have any temporal authority anymore. So he'll have to pass that torch to and be the religious, endorsement of whoever is running the actual show there.
Yeah. And I think, you can argue over sort of who that would end up being, because I think you're right. I think one, the papal states would be less of a political entity. I think over time, what's going to happen is I think we're going to see sort of an earlier version of what happened in our timeline where the papal states get eaten. I think the Pope is going to functionally be reduced to not even just Rome. I think he's going to be reduced to what ends up becoming called the Lateran City, not Vatican City, because the
Right.
Vatican is a
Mhm.
different papal palace.
Yes.
But if they're probably going to be like, all right, dude, you have the palace, you're already there. We're not going to kick you out. Like the Swiss Guard aren't going to come and haul your crap to the door. Like you can have the Lateran.
We're not
But
going to
that's
foreclose on the Lateran.
yeah, but that's going to be his sort of direct political control. But he's going to be this religious figure, and whether the Norman Sicilians come in and take the whole thing, or whether somebody else kind of starts unifying, I actually think the more interesting part of that, kind of leading into sort of our farther long-term knock-on effects, is
Hmm.
what that does to the Renaissance. And
Yeah.
I would actually think that probably it doesn't like supercharge it and kickstart it super early, but I think it does shave some points off the 30-year mortgage, so to speak.
Hmm.
In terms of if you have a pope who's not directly seen as kind of this progenitor of the top down kind of feudalistic one of the reasons why the Renaissance took so long is for so much of medieval history, the priesthood was the only class who could basically read at a universal level,
Yeah.
and they controlled the access to information. Whether the pope still says, okay, you can only read only priests can read the Bible, there's going to be enough counter to that from kind of an orthodox cultural religious perspective. There may be some pushback on that. And
Yeah,
two,
and the small d democratic, organizational structure of the Orthodox churches, I think, would also play a big
yeah,
part in, democratizing the spread of information and the
yeah,
spread of, different religious texts and the Bible itself, for sure.
yeah. And I think, the other part of the Renaissance is these were all these little Italian kind of city states sort of fighting with each other in these interminable wars over, Florence is going to take territory from Genoa and Mantua is going to take territory from Milan and blah, 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 over and over for like 300 years. If you get any kind of even remote centralization of some of those city states, one has to wonder if the inevitable kind of ease of access and ease of travel that comes along with that helps kind of germinate what leads into the Renaissance. I'm not saying 150 years earlier, but maybe 20, 30, 40 years later or
Hmm.
earlier. And that then, that's the beginning of the exponential curve that leads to the compounding of modern day. Sorry to keep mixing like finance and math and all these other metaphors, but you get where I'm going.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one interesting thing. The other, to kind of go back to a geopolitical interesting thing, is once you get to the age of colonization, which let's not forget is not that far down the road. It's a couple hundred years, but in the grand scheme of medieval history, that is not all that far. One of the things that would be affected, let's just for the sake of argument assume that a lot of the things that lead to colonization kind of track in our timeline, where the Spanish and the Portuguese are still kind of the first ones out of the gate. They get to the New World. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which is a very famous kind of early sort of division of the new quote unquote New World and the rest of the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese, is issued like it's called a treaty, but really what it is it was the Pope issuing a papal bull and getting the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs to sign off on it. The Pope is the
Yep.
one who literally drew this random line on the map and said, okay, everything and don't quote me on this, I may be getting it wrong. Everything east of this line is Portuguese. Everything west
Yeah.
of this line is Spanish.
Essentially, so the reason why we had the Portuguese be able to establish a claim over Brazil in South America is because this line happened to bisect right down. I like to think of Brazil as like a face facing the east, and
Yep.
it's like the nose of Brazil basically
Mhm.
was given to Portugal. So Portugal had claim to Brazil due to that.
Yeah.
But and this is because this is something I thought of as well, is no pope with as much power as of temporal affairs to interfere in things like this, and you don't have the Treaty of Tordesillas being
Mhm.
given by the Pope and being signed off by the Spanish and the Portuguese.
Yeah.
So what this means is that there really isn't any body. There isn't a person, there isn't a pope, there isn't somebody there to call those shots. Spain and Portugal are probably still, Catholic nations. Like, I don't think anything
Mhm.
necessarily
Yeah.
really changes
Oh, no,
there.
no.
But
In terms of colonial
the
territory,
Pope has no authority to really say anything.
yes.
So we have the possibility of, not just the Spanish, like basically coming in with, the conquistadors and everything going on there. We could be having a new world that is much earlier on, a much more, stringent fight, I guess you can say, between all of these different powers. It's kind of like we think of, like, in our timeline, we have the division of Africa, the carving up of Africa sort
Yeah.
of thing. I think we could have a scenario in this timeline where it basically comes down to all of these European countries want a slice of the American pie, and you start having divisions,
Yes.
hypothetical divisions of that going on. I don't know exactly how that would happen, when that would happen, because, we have to remember that, even up until like the 1600s, for example, California was still thought of as an
Mhm.
island,
Yeah.
as like some sort of mysterious, land of El Dorado or whatever. So like a lot of this area isn't even necessarily like mapped accurately, at this point. So we have no Treaty of Tordesillas. We have no Pope interfering on that level. So what would this, I think, necessarily directly, I guess practically mean? Like, do we think the Spanish, for example, are going to try and, take over certain lands that they hadn't in our timeline?
Well, I think it's going to be I think initially, no Treaty of Tordesillas means there's no kind of understanding between the Spanish and the Portuguese, who
There's no gentleman's agreement.
there's no gentleman's agreement. So basically, for the first 150 years, give or take, of New World colonization, it's just the Spanish and the Portuguese. The French aren't really there, except maybe in kind of Nova Scotia and
Yeah.
sort of Eastern Canada. The British maybe have Virginia, but that is it. Other
It's
than
very, very
maybe one Caribbean
tertiary.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see, instead of Portuguese Brazil as this monolith, and then basically the rest of Spain, South America being Spanish, Central America, Mexico being Spanish, it's a much more checkerboard, as
Yeah.
the Spanish and the Portuguese.
It's
They
almost like you're looking at a Risk board game.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where
They
you
don't
kind of
wanna
have these tit for tat
consolidate.
territories.
They
There's
want
no
to checkerboard
consolidation.
and
They're
get
wanting to try and
as much as they can.
They
Yeah.
want to get as much as they can possible. Yeah, and be the first guys there to do it.
And then that gets into, I kind of wonder, and we don't really have to go into this, but it's an interesting thing to think about. If that happens, there is then inevitably going to be some kind of conflict between Spain and Portugal,
Yeah.
who don't have a treaty keeping the peace over some of these colonial territories. I almost wonder if either the Iberian Peninsula would be more evenly divided between Spain and Portugal, or whether there would only be one country in the Iberian Peninsula
That is actually
as a result of
really
one of these
interesting-
colonial things.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting thought.
Yeah. Because and no offense to any Portuguese listeners who might be listening, Spain and Portugal are very closely culturally related, to the point that my British tour guide, when I went to Spain, jokingly told us that if you want to learn how to speak Portuguese, just speak Spanish in an impersonation of Sean Connery. And that is basically how you speak Portuguese. Again, no offense. This is just what my British tour guide told me. So I think that's one interesting knock-on effect. And the other one, the last one I'll kind of throw out as we sort of wrap things up is kind of going back to the idea of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
One of the other things that a very restrictive, centralized papal control of culture and thought leads to is, going back to the restriction on the ability to read the Bible. I think the invention of the printing press might
Yeah, that
also
was in the
be
back of
able
my
to
head.
happen earlier too, just because
Yeah.
there's not this pressure against the ability of people to directly read, whether it's the Bible or other information, and only the priests being able to do it. I wonder if, now, I'm not saying the printing press is going to be invented in like 1204, but it might be invented sometime in the early 1400s or the late 1300s instead of, I forget, 1654, I think is
I
when
was gonna
Gutenberg invented
say,
it or
I want to
something.
say the Gutenberg press was sometime in the 1630s
Yeah.
to 50s. Yeah,
And
I want to look. I want to
it may
fact check
even
that
be
real
in
quick.
the 1500s or something. But basically, yeah, so it was the mid 1400s.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was the mid 1400s because I thought that seems like a little late for it. So yeah, mid
Yeah.
1400s still, but like it
But
can
like
either
if it's
be
even
around the
early
same. It could,
1400s,
even if it's early 1400s, I think that would still be a pretty. That would have a rather
it's a
substantial
dramatic
impact.
escalation.
Yeah, because now you're having, and also I do think that like the Reformation, for example,
Yeah.
would probably happen still within the Catholic Church, but it would not be as dramatic because first of all, you have the influence of the Orthodox Church kind of being stronger, democratization of information, as we mentioned before, the feudalistic structure underpinning a lot of medieval Europe during this time is, probably not as strong and more administered by the secular rulers and kings. I think this strengthens, this kind of more secular form of government as opposed to, during this time there was this whole, basis of the divine right of kings
Yeah.
sort of thing, where God specifically ordained them to do this thing. I think there'd be much more of a deeper sacred secular split. Like, if not outright stated, I think practically, pragmatically, you just kind of understand on the grounds that the Pope has not much of anything to say when it comes to how rulers actually run their countries anymore.
Yeah.
You still got to be a good Catholic, or you still got to be a good Orthodox or whatever.
Christian. Yeah, just
Christian
Christian,
ruler.
I think, is the
just
question.
Christian, I think, is the question. It really here because in our timeline we had a much more emphasis on who's Protestant, who's Catholic, whatever. Something that I kind of palled around in the pre-podcast as well is the whole reason we have the Anglican Church to begin with is because a certain king of England, Henry VIII, decided that he wanted to keep divorcing and remarrying wives in his eternal quest to have the child of destiny to be able to rule after him in his stead. And of course, when that never happened, he had to divorce, kill, and marry the next one. Hopefully in that order. I hope he would not kill them before he divorced them.
Or marry them after he killed them.
Or marry them after he killed them. Yeah.
I mean, I know Henry VIII was crazy, but I don't think he was that weird.
I didn't think he was that weird. I didn't think he was into that.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point. I think in a world like this where, like I said, this, it's more of a overall Christianity, and then under that it becomes a purely doctrinal question, not a political question.
Not a political religious question. So you have things. So the Anglican Church may question mark have happened, but honestly, I don't think there really isn't as much of a basis for that. If the whole basis of breaking away from the Catholic Church is the Pope is telling me that I can't, remarry, so I'm just going to make my own church that says it's okay.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is that this is actually an area that the Pope can tell people to do and not do things.
Yeah,
because it's within his religious authority.
Yeah, but Henry VIII also, if the Pope is just the Bishop of Rome, and he's the Pope of this one flavor of Christianity, you also have to remember there's 4 other patriarchs. So Henry can just like spam out letters and be like, "Hey, will somebody please give me this annulment so I can go on?"
Somebody help me here. Yeah, actually, that's kind of a very when you said that, they gave me a very funny mental picture of like, King Henry just spamming the WhatsApps of the other 5 synods or 4 synods and just being like, Hey, can you get me a divorce certificate? Hey, can you get me a divorce certificate? And the first one that gets me that, I'm co-signing
Yeah,
to
he's
that
good.
sign on.
Yeah.
Like I'm good, you know?
Yeah.
I just think that's really a funny mental picture.
Yeah. And I think not just with England, but also just with like the history of Europe in general, if you have, because there's certainly going to be some kind of reformationist things that happen, whether it's an out and out, Protestant versus Catholic, and it's more of a just sort of doctrinal divergences among equals kind of thing. That alone has knock-ons to, the 30 Years War, the wars of religion, the
Yeah.
Anabaptist revolt in Munster, like all of these things that kind of make these formative, developments for all kinds of reasons across Western Europe either don't happen or are totally different in their justification because there's less of a outright kind of zealous religious component
There's not
to
a
it.
religious zealous component to it, and it becomes much more of like political jockeying, as opposed to having to claim that, well, the Pope supports me, or, well, actually, I'm a Protestant and I think we should be, just completely uprooting everything that has to do with Catholicism. Like there's much less of that, and it's much more of a, okay, well, we all have baseline Christianity as our basis, but here are my, genealogical claims to the throne, or here are my reasons why I think you're just a bad person and you should feel bad and I should be
Yeah,
the one running the show.
yeah, exactly. So I
You know,
think I think we've created kind of both, and this is one of those episodes that I loved because from something that seems so small, we've both created such big implications for what could change, and yet at the same time, not that much really changes.
yeah,
One
it's
of those
one of those
weird
ones where it's
juxtapositions.
it's it's a weird one because like I think at first one would think, oh my gosh, this could have like a massive impact on things. Like my initial gut reaction when I kind of first started writing notes on this is like, hey, Pope Leo the Ninth could have been deposed or replaced. Like we might have been looking at the possibility of like the Catholic Church, you know, having decreased trust and power structure and authority, kind of thing. Like, could we maybe even not have a Catholic Church? But I think when you actually look at like what's realistic about this, I think realistically speaking, we would still have the Catholic Church. Pope Leo would still be in the Vatican. Or sorry, not
The
what's the name of
Lateran.
The Lateran, excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
You just
literally
smush the two
fused.
palaces
I
together and
smushed
called
the
it
two
the
palaces
Vatican.
together and called it the Vatican.
The
That's
Pope
absolutely
is
hilarious.
Voltron.
Exactly. Um, so like, probably practically there's a lot of things that would, stay similar, but I think there's also a lot of things that when you look at the gears, the mechanisms of history, just kind of being slightly altered or slightly changed, that could
Mhm.
lead to some big downstream effects. Um, Something that is also kind of a little bit of a Hail Mary, kind of more to our modern day and age that I'll throw out as well, is there is a possibility, in my view, that the name of Pope Leo could have been somewhat cursed, somewhat a kind of like of a pox on that name. Because
Mhm.
if you have that name, if you have Pope Leo the Ninth being the one that says, yeah, I'm going to rely on my authority on the basis of a completely forged document, and
Yeah.
then that's exposed to be a fraud, I'm just going to say Pope Leo the Ninth might have ended up being the last Pope Leo.
Yeah.
Because relevant to our modern day and age, we actually have a modern Pope
That's
Leo,
right. I forgot he's Pope Leo.
Pope Leo the 14th. And so I think it wouldn't have changed anything major, I think, in terms of, and we didn't even get into the whole history of, the popes and the anti-popes and like the whole hot mess of medieval church history at certain
Yeah.
points. But I'll just throw this out there and say that there probably would have been, again, less of a reason or emphasis for anti-popes to arise and to come up and try to claim the papacy for themselves, because the papacy is no longer seen as a political authority structure.
Mhm.
It's seen as a religious structure for sure.
Yeah.
And so
It's
there's
almost an
probably ecclesiastical arguments and
yeah.
ecclesiastical anti-popes that and this is something that I saw in research for this episode too, that I didn't even know of. There are technically anti-popes for every pope, like
Mhm.
all throughout history, even to the modern era. It's just that they're nominated by these little, spin-off churches, and no cardinal actually ever, supports them or nominates them.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you have a presidential candidate, an incumbent presidential candidate, and you maybe have one or two, perennial candidates that are always running and who are never going to win.
Yeah,
But
it's like the president for the Green Party every 4 years. It's like, okay, they're running,
yeah,
but
yeah, but they're never actually going to gain enough support to win, the reins.
yeah.
So, so that would be interesting to see how that would affect history. But I'm just going to throw out there, I think Pope Leo as a name is retired after this point, and we would still have probably a lot of the same, popes, and we would still have who is now referred to as Pope Leo the 14th, but he would probably have named himself something different.
Yeah. And I think, to the anti-popes thing is kind of a good point because that gets to this whole wars of religion and sort of the nature of the supreme authority. If, with a more kind of orthodox influenced papacy or a less overtly supreme papacy, I think, is to take the case of, an Anglican church, if it comes up, for example, I think instead of a separate church, it would be, you know, Anglican Orthodoxy under the Patriarch of Canterbury.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to see, I
Yeah.
think, that kind of thing pop up all across Europe rather than, the Anglican Church is the real church. Oh, the Catholic Church is the real church. Oh, or the Lutheran Church or the, blah, blah, blah. It's
Yeah.
less the supreme church. It's just, okay, we're this church, we're still Christian, but this archbishop or this patriarch in this city is the one we're going to kind of take our lead from, but everybody's all one big happy, or at least one family at the end of the day.
I would say based on the history of the church, and I'm not picking on the church in general, but I'm just going to say based on church history, I'm going to say it'll probably be much more likely referred to as one big dysfunctional family.
Yeah, I did claw back the happy part. I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
wait,
yeah.
no.
Yeah, but I think overall, I think the rancor and just like literally like burning Anabaptists at the stake and killing them and like all of that kind of parts
Mhm.
of European history. I mean, let's be honest, it's probably still going to happen because people are just crappy and do things like
Yeah.
that over like religious debates or whatever. But you're not going to have the sanction of,
It's not going to be as institutional, I think.
it's not going to be institutionalized, in other words. And that has some really interesting downstream effects, I think, in terms of, I like we made reference to Treaty of Tordesillas, colonization of the New World. America, the English colonies were mainly founded for, kind of two main reasons. You have the political reasons and, England wanting to establish these colonies. And you have, like the capitalist, I guess, not capitalist, mercantilist,
Mhm.
sort of minded people who are seeing this vast land of opportunity and saying, all right, I'm going to get, my 40 yards in a mule sort of thing, to make reference to a
Yeah.
later political movement. We're just conflating everything that we can and possible, throw it into this pot of an episode mixed up with love and make it all taste good. Um, but you also had a lot of people like, the Puritans, who were, if I remember correctly, a particular strain of Dutch Reformed, I want to say.
I forget if they were Anglican or Presbyterian.
I want to say they were Presbyterian because the Anglicans didn't like them
I
very
think,
much.
I think they were like a sect of Presbyterianism, but yeah, basically
Mhm.
the Puritans were one of the big, especially in New England, the colonial,
They
progenitors of
were one of the
America.
biggest influences in America. And so you had things like the Salem witch trials. You
Mhm.
had a lot of these things, again, happening on the basis of, religion that, and I mean, let's be real, Salem witch trials probably still would have happened just because we were dealing with claims
Yeah,
about people who were
and
like
mushrooms.
out and out Satanists and mushrooms and things like that. But again, the tenor and the direction of both like, Christianity and all of these, how it intersects with these whole political, geopolitical trends, it would have been a lot different.
Yeah.
It definitely would have been a lot different. I think the last thing I'm going to throw in here before we finish off, and then Dylan, if you have anything to say as well, you can throw it in at the very end before we conclude. But at the top of my show notes, I have a reference from one of my favorite works of fiction, and I honestly need to go back and read through this. I read through Inferno and Purgatorio by the famed Italian poet Dante, but then I got through a decent portion of Paradiso. I need to finish that, and then I think I need to go back with a better understanding of history, because I was fortunate to have a edition of the book that is heavily footnoted and has a lot of references to what was actually going on. If you just read through it without an understanding of medieval political wranglings in history, it's kind of confusing. Even if you get like a 40,000-foot overview of what the story is about. My favorite thing about Inferno is that Dante basically uses it as a massive diss track against everybody that he hates. Like, he puts popes in there that he thinks are heretics, that he doesn't like. He puts in people, that he respects greatly, like, the Greek poets and philosophers. He puts them in the least bad circle of hell because he's like, well, even though they're not Christians, they're really cool people. And I think God is gonna, be cool with that. They can't get to heaven, but they'll just be in the least bad circle of hell kind of thing. So at the top of my show notes, I have a reference that I just wanted to throw in here. But Dante made an explicit reference to this donation. And keep in mind, Dante was writing this in around 1200, the 1200s or 1300s or so. He writes in Inferno, "Ah, Constantine, how much evil was born, not from your conversion, but from that donation that the first wealthy pope received from you." In this timeline, I think Dante would be having many different things and different ways to diss people that don't rely on the fact that this donation occurred. In fact, I think Dante would probably write many, many lines talking about the fraud that was perpetrated. And he would probably even put Pope Leo IX in that circle of hell, because I think there is a specific circle of hell talking about forgers and fraudulent.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there is. So Pope Leo IX would have ended up there in Dante's Inferno. I would just like to say I would love to see Dante's diss track on Pope Leo IX.
It's the first rap battle of history.
Exactly.
No, I think that's it for me. I think we've
got everything. We've got everything we wanted out here.
We've wandered far afield and answered no questions and raised many. So as usual, I like to do my damage and then leave with no further elaboration. I'm like the Kool-Aid man busting through a wall. So I will only say, to end this episode, as we do all episodes, if you should come across a fork in time, Evan, what should we do?
I think, Dylan, that we should take it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.